So I don't generally paint landscapes. When I do paint landscapes, I'm usually going to throw a person or an animal in there because that's my favorite subject matter. People, my fellow human beings doing things, animals doing things, humans and animals doing things together, portraits, the human form, people with hats. These are my favorite things to paint. This image, this illustration, was inspired actually more by the landscape, which is a little bit of a interesting take. I was driving on the freeway going toward Los Angeles and was struck by the beauty of the light and the shadow after some recent rainstorms. The yellow mustard on the hills and all the texture and the cool light and the warm light and the clouds in the background. And that all became the inspiration, but I didn't want to do just the landscape. So I found an appropriate subject matter where I could add people and animals into this to make a narrative illustration. So this painting is titled Good Company, and it's in private collection, and prints are available for sale on my website. So I wanted to share my process and how I pulled it all together into the finished painting. So this is a photo that I uncovered in my, what I call my scrap file, my inspiration archives. And I like the fact that there's a lot of unity in it. And I like the attitudes of the figures. They're casually riding. You can tell they've been on horseback a long time. And this became my inspiration for the human subject. The landscape component was actually in my memory. I just remember the colors and the textures. And so I drew that basically by hand. I didn't follow any photographic reference or any other inspiration other than what was in my head. So this is a preliminary sketch. You can see that it's just a few inches in size, but I'm basically working out the composition at small scale and also figuring out light-dark patterning, which is also known as no-tan. Just basically laying in very sketchily what's going to be light and what's going to be dark. From there, I build out the drawing and transfer it to the watercolor paper, which you can see I've stretched onto a pine board and just using flat thumbtacks to adhere the paper. The paper is slightly damp when I lay it down on the board, and then I tack it down, and then it takes a few hours to dry thoroughly, but the stretching of the watercolor paper prevents it from curling and warping and getting puddly when I'm working. So this is now a flat piece of stretched watercolor paper. It's Strathmore 140-pound cold press, and I've linked it in the description below if you're interested. But you can see that it's basically a frame-in-frame composition. So there's, of course, the outer frame, the edges of the painting, and then the inner frame is basically the group of the three horsemen. And so it's structurally fairly simple. The landscape, again, is something that I laid in out of my imagination, and I'm actually going to build that out and refine that as I go. But this kind of landscape is very typical where I am in SoCal. And here the dog isn't fleshed out fully yet. I decided not to run with the little bulldog that was in the original photo, but I replaced him with my dog, which is an Australian Shepherd. The palette I use is basically a butcher tray. It is a flat tray with sides, and I can easily pull paint across it, and you can see my mixing process using various colors and hues to actually create a gray. When I have my colors mixed, I start laying in, kind of blocking flat color in a mid to somewhat light value. So things are not really dark, but I usually lay in color in a color block method, and just throughout the entire painting I'm going to lay in and assign a basic color to everything in the painting. And then I will return and start building up light and shadow. I use transparent watercolor, I use gouache, and then I finish with colored pencil for the very fine details. So here you can see I have almost finished laying in the initial color blocks, and you can see that the dog is now the Australian Shepherd, and I've laid in the cast shadows onto the road and started building out some of the cast shadows on the hats. And here I've blocked in the colors on the horses and made the light and shadow areas in the clothing a little more distinct. And here I've panned out a little bit so that you can see the palette there on the right, and the reference photo is up there in the upper left corner. And you can also get an idea of the size of the painting. It's a little less than 18 by 24 inches. So my painting technique with the watercolor, I start with watercolor and then build up to gouache, and then, as I mentioned, refine with the final details in colored pencil. But my painting technique, if you will, is almost a drawing technique with the brush. I don't flow a lot of water. I don't use watercolor in the way that a lot of people do, where I'm flowing water onto the surface and then adding the pigment in and adding other colors of pigment. I'm basically mixing everything on the palette and then laying it in onto the painting where it needs to go, and keeping the color break areas, the light shapes, the dark shapes, fairly well defined and confined. And so it almost looks like I'm drawing in a lot of ways when you're looking at how I'm handling the brush. That's just the way I do it. It's through the relationship of light and shadow, or light values and dark values, that we are able to discern form, perceive form visually, and to separate one object from another, or separate one object from the space around it. Where you have minimal value contrast, light-dark contrast, it is harder to perceive the forms in front of us. And so painting realistically, one of the things that's very important to depict is the light-shadow relationships and an understanding of light and light logic principles, where you're looking at not just the basic light-shadow shapes, but you're looking at the highlight, you're looking at the reflected light. These are the things that turn the form, that cause the form to appear volumetric in the two-dimensional plane. And so light and shadow need to work together and complement each other to communicate the form. I'd also like to note here that I spend a lot of time looking at the reference photo at this point, because I am trying to communicate those shadow shapes, those light shapes, with a high degree of accuracy, so that what I end up with is a painting, an image that convinces. It is realistic, it tells the story sufficiently, and it actually depicts what I want it to depict. So I spend a lot of time looking at the subject matter, and I would do this also if I'm painting from life. I spend more time looking at the reference than looking at the painting surface. Once I have those middle values laid in and I've started to build up the shadows, I start going in with the darker values. So you can see how the form starts emerging from the flatness of the paper. But it's very important to get a wide range of values so that there's enough contrast in the image that the image is easy to understand. It's easily read. And here I'm just building up the tail a bit. Light colors advance forward out of darker colors, and darker colors advance forward against lighter colors. So the value pattern in an image is a series of light, dark, light, dark, light, dark sequencing. You can see that I have developed the painting a lot further, and I now have the landscape, the background laid in, and I'm coming back into the figures to beef up or add more detail and more depth by adding darker values into the shadows. Here I'm coming back in with some midtones and just laying them in to get the middle values on the jacket. And between the high key colors, the mid key colors, and the low key colors, basically the jacket is coming to life, the figures come to life. So you can see I go back and forth once I have the shadows laid in, once I have the whole painting basically addressed in terms of the light shadow and the color story. I will return to each area and develop it more. So having developed the darker values first, I then go back in with the lighter values, and this is where I start transferring to the use of gouache, which is an opaque watercolor. And so I can just lay it on top of the transparent watercolor. And so I come back in with highlights and center light areas and detail things out so that they become much more dimensional. This is actually a very enjoyable part of the process for me because I know I'm getting toward the end, toward actually completing the painting. I develop paintings in sprints basically. I don't have one long continuous session. I probably spend in one sitting maybe 1 to 2 hours, and then I walk away and then come back to it. So although it might take me maybe 5 hours to develop a painting, that's not all done in one session. And I'll work on the painting over a matter of days or even a few weeks. The last phase is coming back in with colored pencil, and I use a variety of brands of colored pencil. Some are waxier than others, and depending upon whether I'm going over gouache or over transparent watercolor, I will generally use different pencils because of their different characteristics. But I use the colored pencil. Yeah, this happens a lot. Have to sharpen. So I use the colored pencil for subtle variation in color, usually popping more saturated, usually dropping in highly saturated color on top of darker neutral colors, just to give it more dimension and actually more lifelikeness. So that's what I'm doing here, coming back in with the red and just hitting various surfaces to round them out, to pop some color in just for little visual details that really make a difference. Here, coming back in with yellow. And very often the way I'll do this is I will pick a color for the highlights or the center light areas on the where the light is hitting directly. And then I'll pick another color for the shadows. So this is the finished painting in all of its glory. And the original painting is in private collection. If you're interested in purchasing a fine art giclée print, make your way over to alvalin.com/shop and look for Good Company. Thank you so much for watching. If you have questions, drop them in the comments.